History has spent 2,000 years trying to reduce her to her beauty. It has never quite succeeded, because the more carefully you look at what she actually did, the more the beauty becomes almost beside the point. She spoke 9 languages in a world where the rulers of Egypt had not bothered to learn Egyptian for 300 years. She was the first Ptolemaic pharaoh to actually speak to her own people in their own tongue. A fact so extraordinary, so damning of every ruler who preceded her, and so immediately revealing of the specific quality of mind that made her exceptional, that it deserves to be the first thing said about her rather than the last. She was a mathematician and a philosopher and a physician whose writings on medicine and cosmetics circulated in the ancient world under her own name. She understood economics with a sophistication that let her manage the most complex revenue-generating state in the Mediterranean. She navigated the most dangerous political landscape on earth, the late Roman Republic in the final decade of its existence, with a skill and a longevity that none of her male contemporaries, including the men she allied herself with, managed to match. She held Egypt for 21 years, in a world that was eating itself alive. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator, Cleopatra the father-loving, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last independent pharaoh of ancient Egypt. And her story, the real story, stripped of the 2 millennia of male fantasy and political propaganda that have accumulated around it like sediment around a jewel, is one of the most remarkable accounts of political intelligence under pressure that the ancient world has left us. She was born in approximately 69 BCE in Alexandria, the magnificent city that Alexander the Great had founded on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast 3 centuries before, and that had become, under the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death, the most extraordinary city in the ancient world. Alexandria at its Ptolemaic peak was a city of perhaps 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban centers on Earth, whose harbor could accommodate the largest merchant fleets in the Mediterranean, whose lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and whose library and museum were the intellectual headquarters of Hellenistic civilization, the place where Euclid worked out the foundations of geometry, where Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using a stick and the angle of shadows, where the accumulated learning of the Greek world was collected, catalogued, and built upon by the greatest scholars of the age. Into this world, one of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary intellectual richness and extraordinary political danger, Cleopatra was born the 3rd child of Ptolemy XII elites, the reigning pharaoh, a man whose nickname, the flute player, conveys something of both his personal interests and the contempt in which the Alexandrian population held him. Ptolemy XII was a weak and unpopular ruler whose primary political achievement was spending enormous sums bribing Roman politicians to recognize his legitimacy as king, a recognition so desperately needed because the Roman Republic was the dominant power in the Mediterranean world and because Egypt's wealth made it an obvious target for Roman ambition. The cost of those bribes was passed directly to the Egyptian people through taxation, generating the popular resentment that eventually produced the uprising that drove Ptolemy XII from Egypt for several years, during which he went to Rome to petition for military support for his restoration. He was restored by Roman legions in 55 BCE. The specific humiliation of a pharaoh restored to his throne by foreign soldiers at the cost of further debt and further dependence on Roman goodwill. Cleopatra was approximately 14 years old when she watched her father return to Alexandria on Roman terms, and everything she did for the next 35 years was shaped by what that return told her about the nature of power in her world and the absolute necessity of managing Rome rather than being managed by it. She was educated in the Ptolemaic tradition that had produced some of the most intellectually accomplished royals of the ancient world. The Ptolemaic court at Alexandria was not merely a center of political power but a genuine intellectual community, and the royal children were educated in philosophy and mathematics and science and rhetoric alongside the military and administrative knowledge that their eventual roles would require. Ancient sources credit her with writings on mathematics, on pharmacology, on gynecology, on cosmetics, the specific range of a genuinely curious and genuinely capable mind engaging seriously with the intellectual world around her. She studied with the scholars of the museum. She absorbed languages, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, the Parthian language of the empire to the east, Latin, and of course the Greek that was the Ptolemaic court's native language, with a facility that ancient sources find remarkable enough to preserve across 2,000 years. The 9 languages were not a party trick. They were the tools of her governance, the means by which she could speak directly to the priests of Isis in Egyptian, negotiate directly with the Parthian court in their own language, correspond directly with the Jewish communities of Alexandria in Hebrew and Aramaic, and present herself to the Roman military commanders who would determine her fate in their own Latin without the mediating presence of an interpreter who might shade the meaning. In a world of political intelligence, direct communication without intermediaries is a structural advantage of enormous importance, and she understood this completely. When her father Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, leaving Egypt to his 18-year-old daughter and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was approximately 10 years old, with the stipulation that they rule jointly as co-regents and as husband and wife according to the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage, Cleopatra moved immediately to consolidate her own position. She put her name first on official documents. She appeared alone on coins. She began learning Egyptian and presenting herself to the Egyptian priestly establishment not as a Greek ruler of Egypt but as the genuine heir of the pharaonic tradition, appearing in the iconography of the Egyptian goddess Isis, presenting herself at temple dedications in Egyptian dress, performing the ritual functions that connected the pharaoh to the divine order of Egypt with a seriousness and a commitment that the Egyptian priesthood recognized and that gave her a base of popular and religious support that her Ptolemaic predecessors had never cultivated. The political situation she inherited was nearly impossible. Egypt's treasury had been exhausted by her father's Roman bribes. The harvest had failed for 2 consecutive years, a catastrophe in an agricultural economy as dependent on the Nile flood as Egypt's. The Roman Republic was in the final convulsions of the civil wars that would eventually transform it into an empire, and the various Roman commanders who were dividing the empire among themselves all had eyes on Egypt's extraordinary wealth. The Alexandrian political establishment, the courtiers and the military commanders who had prospered under the arrangement of a weak ruler dependent on their support, was hostile to a strong queen who showed every sign of intending to rule rather than reign. The courtiers backed her brother. In 48 BCE, after approximately 3 years of increasingly tense co-rule, Ptolemy XII's advisors effectively mounted a coup, forcing Cleopatra out of Alexandria and into exile in the eastern desert near the border with Syria. She was 21 years old. She was a queen without a capital, commanding a small military force of mercenaries in the desert, watching from the eastern frontier as Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria with a small Roman military force, only 4,000 men, a fraction of the armies that the Roman Republic was deploying in the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, in pursuit of Pompey, who had fled to Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus and had been murdered on the beach by the agents of Ptolemy XIII before Caesar even arrived. The situation that Caesar found in Alexandria in 48 BCE was a power struggle between 2 siblings, an exiled queen with an army in the desert and a young king controlled by his advisors in the palace, with the added complication that Caesar's small Roman force was essentially trapped in the palace quarter of Alexandria by a hostile city and a hostile Egyptian army several times its size. Caesar needed Egypt's grain and Egypt's wealth to fund the rest of his civil war. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled those resources. And whoever had Caesar's backing controlled Egypt. Cleopatra understood all of this with complete clarity. She also understood that the specific circumstances of her position, exiled, unable to enter the city that her brother's forces controlled, meant that she needed to reach Caesar before Ptolemy's people could prevent the meeting. The solution she found has become one of the most famous stories in ancient biography. She had herself smuggled into the palace rolled inside a carpet, or in some versions a linen sack, carried by a single servant, and presented directly to Caesar in his private quarters. The audacity and the intelligence of this act are frequently underestimated in the retelling, which tends to focus on its dramatic quality rather than its strategic content. Getting herself physically into Caesar's presence before Ptolemy's court could prevent or control the meeting was the essential first move in a negotiation of enormous consequence. She had only one asset that Ptolemy XIII and his advisors could not match: herself, her intelligence, her political sophistication, her ability to make Caesar understand immediately that she was a more valuable ally than a 10-year-old boy controlled by ambitious courtiers. She had one chance to make that case. She took it directly, without intermediaries, at considerable personal risk, with a boldness that tells you more about who she actually was than any description of her physical appearance. Caesar was 52 years old. Cleopatra was 21. What happened next? The alliance that became a political partnership that became a personal relationship that produced a son, is one of the most analyzed and most debated relationships in the ancient world. What is not seriously disputed is that Caesar took her side in the Alexandrian conflict, that Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the fighting that followed, and that Cleopatra was restored to the Egyptian throne. She was required to take another brother as co-regent, the much younger Ptolemy XIV, but the practical reality of her rule was entirely her own. She and Caesar spent several months together in Egypt, the famous Nile cruise, traveling up the great river on a barge of extraordinary luxury, displaying their alliance to the Egyptian population and to the priests of the Nile temples who controlled Egyptian religious life and therefore Egyptian popular legitimacy. The political content of this apparently romantic journey was entirely serious. Cleopatra was showing her people their pharaoh, demonstrating the Roman support that secured her position, and conducting the kind of royal progress that established the relationship between ruler and ruled that the Egyptian pharaonic tradition required. Caesar was seeing firsthand the wealth and the scale of the country he had just secured for his ally and assessing what it meant for his own political project back in Rome. She bore a son, called Caesarion by the Alexandrians, Ptolemy Caesar officially, whose paternity she attributed to Julius Caesar in terms that gave the child both a divine Roman lineage and a claim to the Ptolemaic throne that was both politically useful and politically dangerous. Caesar acknowledged the child informally but named his great-nephew Octavian as his heir in his will rather than Caesarion, a decision that would prove fatally important. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She had come to Rome with Caesarion the previous year, living in Caesar's villa across the Tiber while Roman society observed her presence with a mixture of fascination and hostility. She returned to Egypt immediately after the assassination, had her co-regent Ptolemy XIV killed, removing the last potential rival within the Ptolemaic family, and declared Caesarion her co-regent. She was 25 years old and ruling Egypt alone, in the middle of another Roman civil war, with the specific focused clarity of someone who understood that survival required absolute decisiveness. The Roman world divided between Caesar's supporters and his assassins, then divided again between the triumvirs who defeated the assassins, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. Egypt's support, its grain, its gold, its military and naval resources, was the prize that every faction needed. Cleopatra managed the period between Caesar's assassination and her meeting with Mark Antony in 41 BCE with extraordinary skill, avoiding commitment to any Roman faction until the outcome of the civil wars was sufficiently clear to make a sustainable choice. Mark Antony, Caesar's most senior general, the dominant figure in the eastern Mediterranean after the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE, summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia in 41 BCE, intending to question her about her alleged support for his enemies during the recent wars. She came to Tarsus on a barge of spectacular theatrical magnificence, purple sails, silver oars, golden decorations, herself dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. The staging so deliberate and so complete that Plutarch's description of the arrival is one of the most famous passages in ancient biography, and Shakespeare's rendering of Plutarch's account is some of the most beautiful prose in the English language. The staging was not vanity. It was politics. She was presenting herself to Antony not as a petitioner summoned to answer charges but as an equal, a divine queen whose power was sufficient to require theatrical acknowledgement of its nature before any conversation could begin. She was controlling the terms of the meeting before the meeting started. The effect on Antony, and on the crowd of Tarsus residents who abandoned the official welcoming ceremony to watch her arrival, was precisely calculated and precisely achieved. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony that followed the Tarsus meeting was the defining relationship of the second half of her life and the ultimate cause of her death, and it was, from the beginning and throughout, simultaneously a genuine personal attachment and a calculated political partnership in which the two dimensions were so completely intertwined that separating them is probably both impossible and unnecessary. She needed Roman military power. He needed Egyptian money and resources for the Parthian campaign he was planning. They were, by every account, also genuinely attracted to each other, spending the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria in a period of companionship and celebration that ancient sources describe with the warmth of genuine human happiness rather than the coldness of mere political calculation. She bore him twins, Alexander Aelios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. She supported his military campaigns, including the disastrous Parthian campaign of 36 BCE, which failed badly and which she helped him recover from by supplying his retreating army with money and equipment. She expanded Egyptian territory. Antony gave her significant parts of the former Ptolemaic territories in the eastern Mediterranean, including parts of modern Lebanon and Syria and the island of Cyprus, restoring something of the old empire that the Ptolemaic dynasty had once controlled. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, the great public ceremony in which Antony distributed territories among Cleopatra and their children, naming Caesarion as the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar and co-ruler of Egypt, was the act that made the conflict with Octavian inevitable. In Rome it was presented, by Octavian's extraordinarily effective propaganda operation, as evidence that Antony had given himself entirely to a foreign queen, that he intended to move the Roman capital to Alexandria, that he had abandoned Roman values and Roman identity for an Eastern monarchy. Whether any of this was true in the terms Octavian presented it is genuinely debated by historians. What is not debated is that the propaganda worked, that Roman public opinion turned against Antony with a decisiveness that gave Octavian the political cover he needed for the war he intended to fight anyway. The Battle of Actium on September 2, 31 BCE, the naval confrontation between Octavian's fleet under Agrippa and the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra off the western coast of Greece, ended in a defeat whose cause and whose circumstances have been debated by historians for 2,000 years. Did Cleopatra flee the battle prematurely, causing Antony to follow her in a panic that demoralized their forces? Did they execute a planned withdrawal that went wrong? Was the battle already lost before Cleopatra moved? The ancient sources, mostly hostile to Cleopatra, present the flight as cowardice or betrayal. Modern historians have been considerably more skeptical of this interpretation, noting that the sources are not neutral and that the narrative of female betrayal is suspiciously convenient for the victors. What is certain is that after Actium the military situation was irretrievable. Octavian advanced toward Egypt. Antony's forces dissolved, his soldiers and allies switching to Octavian with the specific pragmatism of military men assessing which side was going to win. Antony killed himself in Alexandria in August of 30 BCE after receiving a false report that Cleopatra had already died. A desperate and deeply human ending for a man whose greatest qualities had always been personal rather than strategic. Cleopatra's final weeks are among the most documented and most debated in ancient biography. She met with Octavian, and the meeting between the most politically intelligent woman in the ancient world and the most politically intelligent man in the ancient world is one of those encounters that the historical record preserves only in outline, leaving the imagination to fill the crucial silences. She apparently tried to negotiate, for her children's futures, for Egypt's autonomy, for some arrangement that would preserve something of what she had built. Octavian apparently gave her enough hope to keep her alive for the weeks he needed to arrange his return to Rome with her as the centerpiece of his triumph. The foreign queen in chains, the ultimate symbol of Rome's dominion over the East. She understood what was planned. The triumph, the Roman procession in which defeated foreign leaders were displayed to the Roman crowd before being strangled in prison, was the one fate she had spent her entire political life working to avoid. She had watched Rome eat its own leaders one by one. She had outlasted Caesar and the assassins and the First Civil War and the Second Civil War. She had held Egypt for 21 years against the most dangerous political environment the ancient world had produced. She was not going to be Octavian's trophy. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra, 39 years old, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty that Alexander's general Ptolemy had founded 300 years before, died in her mausoleum in Alexandria. The method of her death is the most famous mystery in ancient biography. The asp, the Egyptian cobra, the royal symbol of the pharaoh, its bite sacred in the Egyptian religious tradition as a means of divine transition, is the version that ancient sources most often report and that has captured the imagination of every subsequent age. Modern historians have proposed alternatives: a poisoned comb, a poisoned pin, a mixture of hemlock and opium, arguing that the asp story may be more symbolically satisfying than historically accurate. The symbol, whatever the reality, is perfect. The last pharaoh of Egypt choosing the royal serpent. Choosing the Egyptian symbol of divine power rather than the Roman symbol of defeat. Dying on her own terms, in her own tradition, as a pharaoh rather than as a prisoner. Making even her death a political statement. The final, definitive, unanswerable assertion of who she was and who she refused to become. Octavian had Caesarion killed, the only surviving child of Julius Caesar, the one person whose existence was a genuine threat to Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra's children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the woman whose marriage Antony had effectively abandoned for Cleopatra, an arrangement of such specific Roman irony that it reads like something from a play. Cleopatra Selene eventually married the king of Mauritania and carried the Ptolemaic bloodline forward into the next generation in a North African kingdom that no longer remembered the grandmother who had held Egypt against Rome for 21 extraordinary years. Egypt became a Roman province. Alexandria became a Roman city. The library survived a while longer before its gradual decline. The lighthouse stood for another 1,000 years before an earthquake brought it down. And Cleopatra became a legend, which is what happens to people too complicated and too capable for the world they lived in to contain them accurately. The legend has been wrong about almost everything except the one thing that the propaganda and the fantasy and the 2,000 years of male storytelling could never quite obscure. She was extraordinary. She was genuinely, historically, verifiably extraordinary, in her mind and in her will and in the specific quality of her political intelligence and in the 21 years she held Egypt against the world. That is not a legend. That is the history. And the history is more remarkable than anything the legend has managed to invent.